Good evening. I'm Anthony Coleman, and welcome to the Austrian Economics Forum. On this series, we're going to look at economics in general and try to explain it in plain English. While we don't solely have a focus on Austrian economists as our guests, we will seek to explain how the Austrian view differs from the Chicago and London schools of economics. For those that aren't familiar, the Chicago School was famous for Milton Friedman's work, while the London School was famous for the works of John Maynard Keynes, and that's typically what's taught in American public schools. With that in mind, please welcome our first guest, Hunter Hastings. Hunter Hastings is a member of the Mises Institute, a business consultant, and co-chair of the Rescue California Educational Foundation. He is also the host of the Economics for Business podcast. You can find out more about Hunter's writings and economic thoughts and the Economics for Business podcast at hunterhastings.com. Hunter, thanks for being our first guest.
Hi, Anthony. It's an honor and a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I want to jump right in and talk about numbers and try to explain some things in plain English. So, when it comes to economics and statistics, much like lawyers and computer people, they all speak their own language, and it's hard for people to understand in plain English what goes on. So I want to start with two kinds of ways to look at numbers, and that is quantitative versus qualitative analysis. And those are $5 or $10 words we just don't hear very often. So could you please explain what those are and what the difference is?
Well, I'll try. The quantitative analysis is numbers. It's the collection of numbers, usually very large amounts of numbers, that can be used to describe the amount of something, the amount of exports, the amount of GDP, the amount of money in the money supply. And it's not only big numbers, but it's the application of mathematical functions to those numbers, putting them in equations so that you can multiply them and divide them. You can do a trend line, you can do a regression, you can average them, you can project them into the future. You perform all kinds of calculations on those numbers. And so that's quantitative analysis. Qualitative analysis is talking to people. It's trying to understand their motivations and their moods and their needs and what they expect, what their emotions are, what their feelings are. And in Austrian economics, since we believe in human action, it's about human beings, we believe in qualitative analysis, which doesn't mean it's inferior in any way. You get deeper and richer and far more useful information about people and about economics from qualitative analysis.
Okay, so quantitative analysis is numbers, right? I might have 6 Coke cans versus 3 Coke cans, so I've doubled my Coke cans, right? But qualitative is tracking my preferences and thoughts. So that's a little bit more abstract. I don't balance my checkbook based on my thoughts. So in qualitative, it's that I have a preference, right? It might be that I have a preference for blue over yellow, but I can't quantitate that. I can't say, I like it twice as much in X number of like units for whatever that might be. But I can put them in order and I can say, well, I like blue better than red, better than yellow. And so while you might look at the past actions to measure something, when you want to understand what somebody's motivations are and what they're going to do in the future, it's really about that qualitative analysis. And it seems to me that the other schools of economist thought don't really bring in that intent or that subjectivism into the conversation. And so with that, I think we've got a great quote from the Austrian economist F.A. Hayek. Without a theory, the facts are silent. So to me, this means that if you just have a bunch of numbers, that you need to try to figure out what they mean, not just collect the numbers. Can you speak to a little bit more about what F.A. Hayek is talking about here?
Well, yes. So he's talking about the Austrian method of economics, and we'll refer to the word later, praxeology. But it takes an understanding of human beings, and that's a theory. And the theory in Austrian economics is human action. And from that first logical step, you can develop a theory and then observe the data about how they behave, and you can find out if the theory works. With quantitative analysis, you have a pile of numbers. You can run these regressions and analyses and quantifications on them and look for patterns. That's what machine learning and artificial intelligence does. But as Hayek says, if you don't have a theory about what is working in the first place, why human beings are behaving the way they are, then you'll observe the patterns, but you won't know what it means. It won't tell you anything. It'll be silent. So you got to have the theory before you start thinking about what the data might or might not be telling you.
So I think that's a great point to transition and start talking about subjective value. Now that we understand the two different ways of measuring preference versus actual numbers, let's jump right in and talk about what subjective value is in the Austrian School of Economics and why is that important?
Well, it's fundamental to Austrian economics, Anthony, and subjective value was the foundational idea for Austrian economics coming in from Karl Menger. And people have wondered what created value. And Marx famously said that it's the amount of labor that goes into the production. That's what value is. And Austrians turn that around and say, no, what's valuable is what people think is valuable. It's what my preferences are and how I attach importance to any service or good that's offered to me. And I do it in exactly that fashion that you just described. If it's blue, I might prefer it over yellow. Or if it's a blue cushion and it's round, I might prefer it to the square black one. It's a set of preferences. I have many, many preferences in my mind at the same time. And so sorting out subjective value is trying to understand how human beings put value on things and how they make decisions about what to choose, what to buy, what to keep, what to give away. Subjective value is an experience in the mind of the consumer, and consumers create value. Businesses don't. Consumers do by consuming.
So let's go back a little bit. So I mean, price and value are often confused for being the same thing. I mean, I look around town here and they've got F-150s and the red ones are $3,000 cheaper than the blue ones. And everybody says, well, look at how beautiful blue that truck is. And in the marketplace, it ends up being worth more money. So why isn't price and value the same thing?
Well, because value is a process. When we think through subjective value, it's not just the point in time of putting down the money in that exchange. And to use your example, let's say there's a F-150 available. I ask myself, is that going to be valuable to me or not? If I'm a building contractor, it probably is. If I'm mom shopping, it might not be. But let's say I think it might be valuable. I then compare it to other options. And I can compare it to a Land Rover, or I can compare it to a Cadillac, or I can compare the blue one to the red one. And then I decide as a consumer how much money I'm willing to pay for that. I may make a bid for it. That's the point where price comes in to make the exchange. But value isn't created yet until I actually use it. So I buy the red F-150 and I'm driving around town and it's pretty practical, but people are looking at me and maybe they think that blue would have been a better choice for me. So I don't get the same prestige value out of the red one than I would out of the blue one. That's part of the value. And at the end of that process, I step back and I say, am I getting value out of this? And so value is this whole process, this whole experience, interaction with other people, because that's part of what creates value. The price is just one point in time where I decide that I'd rather have the pickup truck than that amount of money.
So value is what I perceive as a consumer benefit, but price is what I have to pay in the market to get that benefit. And of course, everybody has different information, different experiences, and different resources. So their value, their subjective value is going to be different based over time, based on that information. And then of course, based on that, they're willing to pay a certain price. And it's really the exchange of the good for the agreed upon price that ties that price to reality. Everything else is just very speculative. Is that a fair characterization of what you're trying to convey?
Yes, perfect. And I would just add that the way to think about about that price at that moment in time. It's a preference. I would rather give up this amount of money and take the truck than the other way around. And it's also an opportunity cost, which is I'm buying the truck and now I can't buy the Prius or something else. So price is a number, it's a quantitative piece of information, but it's not value. It's value is, as you said, my preference.
I think there's a very important point there, which is it's comparative value, right? In other words, it's not just the inherent value of the truck, the steel that goes into it, or how far it can drive on a gallon of gas, or how much cargo it can hold. But what are the alternatives that I might spend those funds on, and are they comparatively better or worse for me? So it's not just the inherent value of the good or service, but what are the alternatives in the marketplace that I might spend money on, whether they're in this exact market or not. And so it's very difficult to project those kind of things, because humans can do one thing and say another, and more importantly, what they want to do and what they actually do divide over time, and people change. And so it's hard to project out based on numbers what those human thoughts and desires really are. And I think that's a great introduction. So go ahead, Hunter.
Now, I was just going to say that you're right about relative value, and then you're also right about time. People can change. I can change tomorrow. Today, I might like the red pickup truck. Tomorrow, I might like the blue pickup truck. They're both parts of my experience of subjective value. So that's exactly right. It's not projectable into the future. It's not stable. It's not in equilibrium. It's constantly changing.
Well, I think that's a great transition to talk about Austrian economics in general, but specifically how it differs from neoclassical economics. So we're going to bring up this chart from De Soto, and we've got three. This is a larger chart. We've only brought in 3 items. And the first is human action. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, that use that $1,000 word praxeology, which is just basically the study of human action. Well, you contrast and compare that praxeology, that study of human action and subjectivity, to the neoclassical paradigm, which has this narrow concept of rationality.
Right. And so praxeology is that fancy word for understanding human action. We've talked a lot about that, how people make decisions, how they make choices, how they interact with each other, which is really important. The mainstream economists want to write equations, and so they need mathematical functions and numbers. And they also need a number of assumptions to make their equations work. So they have a mathematical function, utility, it's a U in the equation, and they assume that the individual has perfect knowledge, understands exactly how much the blue pickup truck is worth more than the red pickup truck, or understands the price of pickup trucks 3 years from now or whatever. And the economists want the individual to be what they call rational. They'll get the most value out of the truck. So they would say whichever one is $3,000 cheaper, that's the most rational. But individuals are always rational, exactly the way you said, which is that each individual is different. The individual always makes a rational decision. It's emotional, it's subjective, and that's what creates the economic system. So praxeology is the way to understand that, understand human motivations, and utility is an item in an equation that a economist can manipulate on a computer. It has no relationship to real life.
Yeah, and utility is interesting, right? Because I saw this great video where Milton Friedman was talking about that there's only 4 ways to spend money, right? The first way is when you spend money you earned yourself on yourself, and you try to spend as few dollars as possible and get the biggest utility or biggest benefit as possible, right? So, if I'm at the fish market and I'm buying fish, well, I want to get as many fish as I can for my dollar. I'm maximizing the benefit of the fish and minimizing the spend of the dollar as much as I can. But the second way of spending money is when I spend my money on somebody else. This is how all Christmas gifts and birthday gifts work. My cousin tells me she wants this DVD. Well, I'm not trying to get 20 of them. I don't care about the utility side, but I want to minimize the price side as much as I can. And so it's half as efficient. And then, of course, when I have somebody else's money I spend on myself, such as a expense account, well, then I want to get the biggest benefit, right? I want the best steak dinner I can get, but I only half as much care about the money I spend up until the limit where my hand gets slapped, right? So if I have a $60 a day per diem for dinner, I'm going to spend $59.99, right? That's kind of the half efficiency that goes on there. And then lastly, we have where somebody else spends somebody else's money for the benefit of yet somebody else. Milton called this one A tells B how to spend C's money on D. And of course, it's very subjective based on the individual, but most of the time they have no motivation to minimize the spend or maximize the value. If you happen to know, how did the neoclassicals explain this paradigm in their formulas? I've never seen it discussed.
Well, no, you're quite right. You couldn't write equations that have that degree of subtlety that Friedman came up in his analysis. And his D, of course, is the government. The government takes money from some people, A, and they as bureaucrats spend it on other people, and they don't care because it's not their money. So, Friedman had a good insight there. But the idea of maximizing utility is just not in a human being's mind. So to take your fish analogy, it's going to be looking at the salmon, which is $2.50 a pound, compared with a trout, which is $1.99 a pound, and trying to figure out which my family would prefer. Then they'll think I'm a good cook. Those are the considerations that are going through a person's mind. And the last thing that happens is I'll exchange this money because I'd rather have the fish than the money. But what I'd really rather have is the benefit of my family thinking I made a good choice and I'm a good cook. So you just can't compute utility as a mathematical equation. I don't think you can even think about it the way that Friedman thought about it. You're trying to get that feeling that you created well-being for yourself and your family or whatever the situation is.
So I think we've got a good start here to understand, how to view the numbers and how Austrians, look at human action versus normal economics. But let's talk about how Austrians view individuals' roles in the economy, whether that's the consumer or the entrepreneur / producer, or whether that's the actual government. We just talked about how difficult it is to measure utility. Can you also mention how they measure productivity and why that's flawed?
Well, yes. So the Austrian method is what they call individualism, methodological individualism, which means that the system, the economy, or my local economy here in California where I live, is the accumulation of all of the actions, the human action of individuals. So every choice that I make, every interaction that I have with other people, everything that contributes to society working together. That's how Austrians think, building up from the bottom. It's people up, if you like. And so it's not about accumulating numbers to get to GDP. It's about thinking through how the system works. And interestingly, modern economics has come up with this new way of thinking, which they call complexity economics, which is another way of expressing Austrian economics, that you can't predict that system. It's so many people making so many decisions and having so many interactions. And one of those individuals is the entrepreneur. Now, they might be in a team or they might be in a firm. But what that entrepreneur is trying to do is create value for other people who are consumers by solving a problem for them, by meeting a need that perhaps isn't as well met as today. And so those entrepreneurs, we think of them as individuals, whether they are individuals or companies, are one of the agents in this system trying to produce a better future, trying to produce well-being, trying to solve people's problems, trying to make them feel better, trying to make them feel subjective value. Interestingly, the entrepreneur doesn't exist in these other schools of thought. They do not recognize the role of the entrepreneur, whereas in Austrian economics, on the production side, the entrepreneur is the driver of the system, as von Mises said.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into what is this entrepreneur and what is this value, right? So people make this subjective decision that this investment or this purchase of this good or this service is good for them. There's some benefit. And, as you touched on earlier, that could be emotional, it could be political, it could be a societal signal, but it could be the actual value. And so for this little section, we'll focus on the actual value. So let's assume that we live on an island and we're going fishing. And we're going out every day and we're spending our entire day to catch 2 or 3 fish to subsistence live. Okay. But then one day somebody is smart and decides that they're going to build a net to catch the fish. But of course, building the net takes time and we don't have lights on the island. So they've got to do it during the day, which means they've got to sacrifice their time fishing, right, to build this net. They're sacrificing time to get efficiencies later. And so, they go without eating for a day or two throughout a week to build this net. And they've got to build a couple of versions to make it good. But eventually they build a good net. And then now they can go out in the ocean. And instead of spending all day, 6+ hours to catch 2 or 3 fish to live, they're out there for an hour and they catch 10 fish and they're done for the day and they move on. So then as a consumer, he says, well, I'll sell you a net for 2 fish. Well, that's a great value for me because I'll save 5 hours a day catching the fish. The consumer has got immediate value that's seen there by the entrepreneur. But of course, the entrepreneur took the risk that the net could have not worked. He could have starved. The people couldn't have seen the value. Maybe they didn't buy the net, or maybe the fish go away. So there's a risk there that the entrepreneur bears, but at the same time, they've got to create value and bear that risk. And so that's really what they get paid for. But it's the consumer that makes the decision that their product or good or service actually has value. And the act of purchasing that is what ties that good or product or service to a price, which is a signal in the market. And so that's kind of the framework that exists. But then when we go to measure productivity, we use this number called GDP. And so, of course, we would say, well, look at the increased fish that went up and that made GDP go up, and look at the nets that were sold and the nets went up. I think it's pretty obvious where the economy grew there. But the economy doesn't measure value. The GDP metric doesn't measure value. It measures productivity. So if the government were to go and just print a bunch of 10-foot tall bricks in the desert, of course, GDP would go up, right? But there's an opportunity cost there. And of course, that leads to the concept of malinvestment, which is unique to the Austrian School of Economics. Tell us what malinvestment is and why we don't see that in other schools of economic study.
Well, you've just described what the economists call Crusoe economics, which is a great way to think of things. And you described the use of technology, making a net, in order to get higher productivity, i.e. produce more in a shorter period of time, or produce better in a shorter period of time. And so that's how entrepreneurs create the future, how they make the economy grow. So they are saving. So you described the not eating for a couple of days. Well, that's saving, so you can spend time on making the net. And because of that sacrifice you made in the present, you become more productive in the future. So that's investment with a return on investment. And that's all in the entrepreneur's combination of resources plus her or his own effort. Now, the example that you described in building concrete blocks in the desert, which the government does all the time, firstly, they had to extract that set of resources from the economy. The government doesn't produce anything, it just takes. And then they may redistribute those resources to build the blocks in the desert, and they may even employ some people. But they haven't created anything. They haven't been productive. They've extracted resources and then they've re-expressed them. So the entrepreneur is the person who sees that other people have a need for betterment, that consumers can appreciate that there's a better opportunity in the future. The entrepreneur is the one who says, I will sacrifice in the present, i.e. start a production process, in order to sell in the future by showing the consumer that I have something better, something that's either more productive or more valuable. And so that the consumer and the entrepreneur are working together to not just increase productivity, but increase value. But the entrepreneur is the driver. The entrepreneur is the one who sees the opportunity, takes the risk of figuring out a way to make that net or create the new opportunity, and then present it to the consumer, which, as we just said, the consumer may have changed by then and wants something else. So that's the risk that the entrepreneur takes. The entrepreneur drives growth, drives betterment, creates improvement, builds productivity. And the entrepreneur just doesn't exist in other schools of economics, Anthony. It's exclusive. Understanding that role is exclusive to the Austrian school.
That seems like such a major oversight to me, because when we think about the top 10 richest people in the United States, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Jeff Bezos, they're all entrepreneurs that have created tremendous value for the consumer. I mean, think about 2-day shipping has kind of revolutionized the way we consume things remotely for Jeff Bezos. And so I think there's something very romantic about the idea that these people got wealthy for the things that they gave the world. And the fact that you can go and do all this math and ignore the human intentions and the human side of this. Better yet, one of the largest creators of value, not just value, wealth as well, in the entrepreneur. And so it seems to me that they're very misguided in going that route. But they also seem to be very focused on GDP as some scoreboard for not only our economy but the global economy. And since that doesn't take into account the actual value added, it's a huge misnomer. And so what can we use instead of GDP? How can we go about determining what value the entrepreneurs are adding to the economy and not get mixed in with the government stimulus and production?
Well, subjective value has to be measured subjectively. It's people's well-being, and we haven't figured out a way to measure that qualitatively. I mean, a lot of surveys that are done about how people feel about their lives and the quality of their lives, and you can see that that's trending in a good direction. Some countries like Bhutan and Tibet have tried to develop a national happiness index, again asking people how they feel about their lives. It's a nice attempt. That well-being is what we're trying to produce, not GDP, and because it's subjective, we can't put a number on it. But we have a sense of it. We know what the feelings of well-being are in the economy. But it all boils down to the individual in the end, Anthony. You can't probably produce that national index. All you can do is try and help one individual at a time. And if well-being is increasing, then the economy is growing and Austrian economics is working.
Well, let's talk about the last item that I think is kind of unique for tonight's show anyway. That's kind of unique about Austrian economics, and that is the Austrian business cycle theory. I think we've all seen the economy go in booms and busts, and everybody's been taught that that's a natural way of the economy working. But the Austrians seem to take issue with this. Can you explain what is this ABCT and how is it different from the way that, say, Keynesian economics sees the business cycle?
So the Austrian economist understands the role of the entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur undertakes what von Mises called economic calculation. So I'm trying to think about what might be valuable to consumers at some future time. I try and predict what the market price would be, but that's a guess. Then I assemble my resources and I take it into the market, and that's going to be some time from now. And so I'm taking that risk of producing now for a sale in the future. Now let's think of that in the very long term. I'm building a skyscraper or some piece of machinery like an aircraft at Boeing or something like that. One of the costs that I have to think about is the interest rate, the cost of money that I need now that I'm going to get back in the future when somebody buys. So I make that calculation. If the government comes in and artificially changes that price, they lower the interest rate cost, then my economic calculation changes, and I might think I can take on a longer term project, or I can increase costs elsewhere in that project. And I do that, but I'm working on a false signal. That interest rate is a signal about what the consumers will want in the future. And I've got a false signal. And so what happens when those interest rates are artificially depressed is longer term projects are taken on, more expensive projects are taken on with more difficult payouts. And when conditions change again, the entrepreneurs discover that that's not a high return effort. In fact, that might be a negative return effort. And so Austrian economists looked at these booms and busts in the economy. They found out that they're always the result of government intervention, right? Extension of credit or increase in the money supply. If there weren't those manipulations, then there wouldn't be the booms and busts. The entrepreneurs would continue to make those economic calculations and get them right. So the Austrian business cycle theory is that those booms and busts are artificially created by government intervention, and they're not necessary. The economy could grow smoothly without that kind of manipulation.
I think we would all want that, right? Have a continuously growing, smooth economy. I think it's definitely a achievable and desirable goal. Well, there's so much more we can dive into. Economics, especially the Austrian school, is so deep, and we will pick this up in further episodes. But Hunter, thank you very much for being the first guest on the Austrian Economics Forum. We appreciate you being on tonight.
Well, I appreciate it very much, and I congratulate you on launching this program, and I look forward to many, many more shows. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you. So that has been the first episode of the Austrian Economics Forum. We will have future guests and talk about many more topics, but please look us up at facebook.com/Austrians and Economics to find out when the latest episode will air. Thank you very much.